So the paper I'm going to present today is work that I've been doing with John Freeban, who's here, and Erin O'Donnell. And it's going to talk about the range of different policies that we've got to provide water for the environment in Australia, and then jump a little bit to what environmental water requirements actually mean and what they look like. And then I'm going to talk about the interaction between the different policies, and that's really the main focus of our paper. So there's three main policies that we use to provide environmental water in Australia: rules-based or planned water, which is historically the sole means that we used, and that's conditions on consumptive users for minimum pumping or for bulk entitlement holders to provide minimum flows downstream of storage. We've also got entitlements, which is now with the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder, that's of course becoming more prominent, and limits to extraction, so the old cap and the SDL. I guess one of the key points that we want to make is that each of these policies is being developed through different organisations and separately. So rules-based water primarily happens through state policy and planning processes, through water resource plans. Entitlements, now we've got the main players, probably the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder, but there's also state and living Murray purchases. And limit to extraction in the MDBA, that's happening through the sustainable diversion limits. And these policies have primarily been developed in isolation, and not a lot of thought's been given, or there's still a lot of unresolved issues in the way that these policies are going to interact. So the focus today is going to be on the Commonwealth purchases and the SDL and their interaction. And the main policy announcement about how they interact through the guide is that the environmental purchases will sit outside of the SDL, so those entitlements won't count towards the diversion limit. So most of you are familiar with the SDL and the buyback, so I won't spend a lot of time talking about what those policies actually look like, except to make a couple of key points. So it's actually required through the Water Act that the SDL is developed in the Basin Plan, but the Water Act leaves completely open what the method is to define the SDL and what form that actually takes. So it can be a quantity of water per year, it can be a formula to develop a quantity of water, or it can be any other method that the MDBA deems appropriate. So it's left completely open. And the MDBA in the guide has set the SDLs, or has indicated that they're going to set SDLs for each of the 29 areas separately. The government buyback, we all know that's the result of National Water Initiative and the Water Act, where they now recognise the environment as a legitimate user of water. And the government's made the commitment that the entitlements that they purchase will retain the same properties as they would have had a consumptive user been using those rights. The Productivity Commission report highlighted that there's actually a variety of different objectives that the government stated for the buyback. So more recently we've heard that it's about easing the transition to these lower levels of water availability. But they've also talked about providing additional water to the environment and particularly meeting short-term needs. And it's also about obtaining the water cost effectively. So before I keep talking about the policies, I just want to jump quickly to what environmental water requirements actually look like. Because I think if we think about the environment as actually having a demand curve for water the same way that consumptive users have a demand curve, that actually informs the way that we think about the policies. So there's a number of different steps in determining what a demand curve looks like, and there's complexities and uncertainty in each of those steps. But importantly, if we think about that, there's fundamental implications. And the key thing is that those demand curves are going to be dynamic. So the same way that irrigators' demands for water vary over time, we see the same thing happening with the environmental demand curve. So one of the key drivers of that is going to be climate, and that's something which is recognised in the SDL process because it's presented as an average annual, which allows for interannual climate variability. But the demand curve is also going to shift with other factors, such as period between watering, so that's the interannual variability, and the resilience of the ecosystem in different areas, and also with society's preferences for environmental amenity. So the reality is that the amount we're willing to pay on government buybacks is going to depend on what's happening with education and health and defence and other things. So just, this is a figure we're probably all quite familiar with. If we think about just simplifying it down to a consumptive demand and an environmental demand. So consumptive demand is irrigation, households, industry. Environmental demand represents demands at the whole range of environmental assets. And we know that the efficient allocation of water happens where the marginal social benefit curves meet, so at Q star. And the premise of all of these government policies is that at the moment we're sitting at some point Q, and if we're able to readjust the allocation to Q star, the benefit to the community is given by the shaded area. And if we think about this in a static state, the SDL or the buyback or some combination of the two can all help make this adjustment. It's when we start to think about it in a dynamic state that the different policies work more effectively. So here I've just put up two figures of where the environmental demand curve shifts. So in figure A, we've got the environmental demand curve shifting up. So that might be because of changed welfare in the community or increasing education about environmental values. And in B, we've got the environmental demand curve shifting down. So that might be because we put in engineering works and ICE on site and we can deliver the water more effectively. So when the demand curves shift, we actually see that the efficient allocation of water changes between consumptive and environmental users. So if we're using SDL as the mechanism to set that, SDL isn't flexible enough to adjust to accommodate shifting demand curves. The buyback is much better suited at being able to vary around changing environmental demand curves. So that then leads us to think about, well, when would you use the SDL and when would you use the buyback? What are they suited to? And if we think about the SDL actually being a limit and a sort of a regulatory type limit, then what that actually represents is some point on the environmental demand curve where as a society we've said we're not willing to provide less under no circumstances. We're willing to pay whatever it takes to provide that to the environment. So it's effectively a vertical section of the demand curve. So if you set that as the limit, the buyback then provides a mechanism to be able to adjust as the gradient of the rest of the environmental demand curve shifts. That kind of makes sense. The other way that the buyback is more efficient, this has been raised in the previous presentation, is that it allows the Commonwealth environmental water holder to move water around between catchments and between environmental assets in a way that the SDL doesn't necessarily do. There's then an issue though about if the entitlements sit outside of the SDL, whether that flexibility is limited. You've got SDLs set for two separate areas and the buyback is sitting outside of them. Trade between the two areas starts to have implications for reliability of the remaining users. I'll just go through this quickly because I think it's something that has been talked about a fair bit in terms of redistribution equity between the two different policies. So the buyback is obviously with willing buyers and sellers, and society is funding the buyback but gains the resulting environmental amenity. In contrast, the SDL is a regulation in the form of smaller allocations per entitlement, and there's a windfall loss across all consumptive water users. But the wider community gains by getting the same change in environmental amenity without the outlay. There is an issue in the way that the SDLs are specified for individual catchments. So the SDL for a particular basin doesn't necessarily represent the additional environmental water requirements for that individual basin. It also includes the environmental requirements from downstream sites are distributed between all upstream systems. So an example of that's the Ovens River, where the guide to the basin plan says that there's zero additional environmental water requirement for that system, but the SDL will result in a reduction of 40 to 45%, and that's to help meet requirements down in South Australia. So if the buyback is being used as the mechanism to reach the SDL, that then suggests that there's a certain volume of water that needs to be purchased from the ovens to address the SDL issue. So it's redefining where the purchases need to happen. And a much more efficient purchasing strategy would be to say that that water can be purchased anywhere upstream of the asset that's being watered. It also then limits consideration of what environmental product best suits meeting the needs of that asset. So the Ovens River is primarily unregulated, so the ability to manipulate that water to meet environmental requirements in South Australia is limited. So one of the stated objectives is easing the transition to the SDL, and this sort of gets to the accounting issue that I was talking about earlier in terms of the transparency in property rights and the impacts on other users. So if the environmental purchases are going to sit outside the SDL, you have a purchase of a share of water moving to the environment, the number of entitlements or shares remaining within the SDL decreases, so the allocation for the remaining users is improved. If you actually want the entitlement to provide additional benefit when you make the purchase, then you'd have to have some adjustment mechanism on the SDL to allow increased water to go to the environment. And that then makes a little bit farcical the idea of a limit if you have to shift the SDL to account for a trade. And where this becomes particularly important is when we start talking about allocation trade on an ongoing basis. So once we've made that initial adjustment, if the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder wants to have ongoing trading options with irrigators, and in this example we've got the environment selling back to consumptive users in a particular basin, if the SDL doesn't shift to account for that, then the increased usage from the irrigator who buys the environmental entitlement will have flow-on effects for the reliability of supply for all of the remaining users. There's also an issue with the water registers. Water registers aren't currently set up to record what the intended use is. So we need to be able to revamp them to actually keep track of what is a consumptive use that's been counted under the SDL and what's an environmental use that doesn't get counted under the SDL. Also has implications in determining how much water the government actually has to purchase. So they've indicated that they're going to purchase enough water to have no impact on remaining consumptive users. There's a question as to what no impact actually means, whether there's some buffer of reliability change that's acceptable. But this figure is just included to give an idea of how difficult that's actually going to be. This is from downstream of the Goulburn River, and this is the water that's released from storage purely to meet environmental needs. So some water's released that provides some environmental benefit in terms of minimum flow requirements, but that's then harvested by downstream consumptive users. This is water release that is purely for environmental purposes. And you can see by the gradient of this curve that if you want to be able to, in 90% of years, ensure that you're having no impact on consumptive users, you'd need to be purchasing close to 40. But it's quite a steep curve, so you have a lot of years where you're not using your full supply.